welcome everybody to the launch of the Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change, the Irish launch of it. So this is Professor Paul Wilkinson, who's one of the authors of the report. So just to tell you a little bit about Paul, he qualified in medicine in Oxford and spent several years in hospital medicine in London before taking on an epidemiological research post at the UK National Heart and Lung Institute. From there he moved to the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, where he first began to research the links between environment and health. And he's now a world authority on air pollution and health. He's been part of a research team that's begun focusing on the health impacts of global environmental change. He's co-director of the WHO Collaborating Centre on Global Change and Health, and he's one of the main authors of the Lancet Countdown, which he'll tell us about. The Lancet Countdown was, the 2017 report was published earlier this week, and as some of you know, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change intergovernmental meeting is on in Bonn next week, and part of that meeting is going to focus on health and climate change, and the Lancet Countdown will be informing that. So it's a pleasure to introduce Professor Paul Wilkinson. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. What I'm going to do is talk mainly about the Lancet Countdown process and the recent publication. It's not so much a general lecture about climate change and health, although there will be a number of areas, I hope, where we might have some discussion and some digression. But my main focus is really to report what the Lancet Countdown process was trying to achieve, and we hope partly did achieve. So the first thing to note is that it is quite a big international endeavour. I think over 70 scientists, a number which is growing all the time, are contributing to the process. And these are the logos of some of the main contributing organisations at present. The background to it is, it arose out of two Lancet publications, two, as they were referred to, commissions, Lancet commissions on climate change and health. And the first of these, essentially, the one published on the pictures on the left-hand side, was a review of what the connections were between climate change and health, and came to the conclusion, as stated there, that climate change is the biggest global health threat of the 21st century. A slightly dramatic statement, but put forward with a reasoned argument about how important it potentially could be for the health of the global population. Then in 2015, there was a second Lancet Commission report trying to go a step further and trying to understand not only the connections but our responses to it, and whether we've been making the right steps and what the challenge is before us. And you can see that by that stage, they changed the message, or had evolved the message. Now it is that tackling climate change could be the greatest global health opportunity for the 21st century. Trying to take the message that not only is climate change a threat, but actually there are opportunities if we learn to deal with it in the right way, not simply because of the protection that it might offer against the adverse effects of climate change, but also because of all the societal changes which it implies have potential benefits for health as well. Now, that second report made a recommendation. In fact, it made 10 or more recommendations. And the 10th was this, that there should be a process to develop a new independent countdown to 2030 to provide expertise in implementing policies that mitigate climate change and promote public health, and to monitor progress over the next 15 years, i.e. to then 2030. With the idea that it would report every 2 years in the Lancet, tracking, supporting, and communicating progress on our response to climate change. So the important thing to realize here is that this is no longer just a review of trying to work out what the connections are, but to initiate a global initiative to keep track on how well we're doing, and to alert people if we're not doing well enough, to help provide evidence where we are making good progress, but to try to fashion and help influence the ways in which our responses are implemented and evolve over time. The unwritten message, of course, is that the general view is that probably we're not doing enough and we need to do more, a lot more quickly. Now, in fact, the process said we report in the Lancet every 2 years is actually going to be a little bit more rapid than that and probably going to be reported every year. I translate that last statement into 2 key tasks for the Lancet countdown process. The first is providing expertise. And I think this means analysis of evidence, of data about what we're doing, and commentary on it, so as to help informed policymakers, those with responsibility for decisions, but also, importantly, the general public, about what is happening, whether we're doing enough, what the potential gains are, what the potential losses are of failing to act or not working the ways which we think we could. And notice particular focus is on policies that, and the brackets is important here, lumping together not just climate change mitigation or public health, but the 2 together. Policies in which achieve both climate change mitigation and affect public health at the same time. And the second objective, the second aim of the process is to track progress and to publish it. And as I gave this very similar talk just an hour or 2 ago, and as I mentioned that context, I come from a school of being much more of the idea that you need to, as a scientist, provide best objective evidence and let others decide and interpret it, more than using it as a point of advocacy. Clearly, this Lancet countdown process is a bit of both. To date, it has more focused on the advocacy issue because we haven't really got the evidence necessary to provide that underpinning that I'll explain over the next few slides, to be able to show exactly how well we are progressing. So at the moment, it's still being used to alert people, to demonstrate that there are health effects and implications, profound implications for all of us, but also profound opportunities for all of us. What I hope it will do in the long run is to provide us with that more objective measure of showing year by year exactly what we are doing, how much progress we're making, whether we're achieving what we need to achieve, what lost opportunities there might be, what new opportunities we might be able to seize. Now, this is the time course so far. So the second of those 2 Lancet Commission reports on the connections between climate change and health was published in 2015. And that was the one whose recommendation number 10 gave rise to the countdown process. So already last year, there was a publication arising from the countdown. It didn't provide any markers or any evidence. It was merely a statement of intent. It says, this is what's going to happen, and we are promising year by year to provide an analysis, a set of markers, indicators, about all the things which are going on globally that have bearing on the climate change challenge in relation to health. So that was published in November of last year, and the intention is every year the publication will coincide with the COP meeting, so COP23, the one that's happening in Bonn next week, under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. That meeting, there'll be a publication the week before, as it is this year, to provide background evidence, which is then can be discussed during that meeting. On Monday, or rather I think it was actually released formally on Tuesday of this week, we had the first of the Lancet Commission countdown reports, which provided the first indicators of whatever it is that we've been able to track. And there will be another report in November of next year, and then, this depends upon being able to gain funding, to be able to provide further evidence year by year by year for the years that follow. Now, the Lancet countdown process has 5 working groups. The first examines evidence on the impacts of climate change. Now, it's a slightly peculiar concept because there's a whole question of attribution here. So what does it mean that there is a climate change-related death or illness? What actually people really mean is current weather conditions. They mean what the weather does to health at the moment. Drought, heat, cold, storms, adverse effects on crops, whatever. But we're observing current weather patterns and as they transpire, the effects on health. The second then is an assessment of whether we're taking adequate action to respond to those threats. Are we learning to adapt from a health perspective? And then the third group, which is the one that I was primarily involved in, and of course you might expect I therefore think is one of the most important, is the ancillary effects of climate change mitigation. And to be clear what I mean by that, this is not trying to say we are avoiding the effects of climate change. It is trying to understand what are the benefits now of all those steps that we take to move ourselves away from dependence on fossil fuels. So there are short-term, immediate benefits. Whatever happens to our influence on climate change process, there will be immediate benefits now of the transition to a low-carbon economy. Because a low-carbon economy is cleaner, it has less environmental pollution, and all sorts of potentially, usually, positive implications for health. And the last two working groups, there's one on the economics and financing, and finally on the political and broader engagement. I'm going to say much less on those two, but I'll say a little bit about the first three in particular. So the first is impacts. Now, actually, I don't think we have done yet a very good job in this Lancet countdown process. The publication is vast. It looks very impressive, and it is in many ways impressive. But we had set ourselves a very particular task, the two that I mentioned about providing analysis and evidence to inform policy, and secondly, to track changes. And we haven't really quite got to the stage of being able to answer either of those points properly. At least not from the perspective of being able to track impacts on health. But we do have evidence of impacts on exposure. So the first and very simple thing was about, well, what is happening to temperature? Now, this is an analysis that was led by Peter Cox at the Hadley Centre, part of the Met Office in the UK, based in Exeter. They looked at data from monitoring data about the trends that there have been over the last 1.5 decades, 2000 to 2016. And the difference of their analysis was that they didn't just look at global temperatures, because, of course, most of the surface of the Earth is covered in water, and temperature changes over water are much lower than they are over land. This was analysis of trying to coincide with the temperature analysis with where people live. So it gave less weight to areas where nobody does live. And the conclusion they had that over this period of 2000 to 2016, there had been about a 0.9 degrees Celsius average increase in temperature. Doesn't sound much, and in one sense it isn't, but it is big in the scale of the sorts of change the Earth goes through, particularly for the viability of ecosystems. If you go back to the last glacial maximum, and by the way, we have spent most of the last million or so years in ice ages rather than periods of warmth, which we're in now. We're in a very brief interglacial period. Most of the time we are in the ice age. Since the ice age, temperatures have warmed by 4 or 5 degrees Celsius. So a 1 degree warming on that already is a proportionately large impact. And of course, the estimates are that we could end up with a 4 or 5 degrees Celsius warming over this rest of this century. That is a very big change from where we have been historically. If it takes 4 or 5 degrees Celsius from the last glacial maximum to today, we have as big a change potentially going over, again over the course of this century, but at a much, much, much faster time course. And the analysis is that these temperatures of where people live have gone up quite rapidly. And furthermore, if you look at who is vulnerable, i.e. who generally these are low-income populations who have fewer resources to respond, that the number of people, vulnerable people, exposed to heatwave events has increased appreciably by around 125 million people over that period as well. Now, it's hard to interpret exactly, well, what does this mean? It's, temperatures are a bit warmer. What it means is that associated with those things, there will be periods of when it's more difficult. There are direct threats to health. There are difficulties in going about your everyday life. And there will be indirect effects on things such as crops and certain disease patterns. One of the themes that's emerging a bit more that's emerged over the last few years is interest in labour capacity. And what do we mean by that? Well, it is to do with the fact of if it gets very hot, it becomes more and more difficult to work, to be physically active. And on a day like today in Northern Europe, it may seem a rather distant problem, but if you come from a part of the world where temperatures are regularly above 30 degrees Celsius, and you have to work outdoors, and then the temperatures rise still further, it is a serious problem. Now, this calculation is somewhat theoretical. The statement at the bottom is taken from the report, but this bit is my wording in brackets, may in theory have, because we don't actually know and can't track this directly, but the statement is physical labour capacity in populations exposed to temperature change has, or in my words, may in theory have decreased by about 5.3% between 2000 and 2016. Their capacity for work. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, this is based on an assessment of something known as the wet bulb globe temperature. And there is a very precise relationship between your physiological response and wet bulb globe temperatures. With a high enough wet bulb globe temperature, there is a limit to how much work, i.e. watts of energy, you can generate by your own activity before you start to raise your core temperature. And this calculation is based on the assumption of what fraction of time do you have to rest in order to avoid moving into the physiological period when you would overheat. Your core temperature would rise. And that's very clearly related to wet bulb globe temperature. So if you can calculate how that temperature has changed, you can, in theory, look at the productive capacity on individuals. So that's precisely what was done here. Now, it's a slightly indirect method. We don't have the precise measurements to be able to construct these measures accurately. But the assessment is already that the types of temperature changes that have been going on are probably having a perceptible impact, adverse impact, on the capacity of people to carry out their everyday livelihoods. At the moment, it is pretty theoretical, but as these type of risks increase further, it would become increasingly visible and prominent in everyday lives. And then there's things like infectious disease. I'm sure all of you have had views and have had discussions about what climate change may do for infectious disease. This graph is probably not legible to most of you, but it's only the pattern I think that you're meant to see. And what it shows is this is a long list of different countries, and you may not be able to see, but it goes goes year by year from 1950 up to 2015. And for each year, there is a color code about the potential, the transmission potential for vector-borne diseases. In this case the capacity for the transmission of dengue, and showing how that goes from a blue color to a red color, which is going from relatively negative to more positive potential for dengue transmission. Now, this has to be interpreted with caution as well, because the general pattern is, of course, that we're getting warmer, and so the transmission potential for vector-borne diseases such as dengue, but also for a whole variety of other illnesses, malaria, chikungunya, Zika, you name it, they are likely to increase as we have warmer temperatures. And the basis for that judgment is based on good science, and actually fairly precise science. If you look at, for example, malaria, you can take the disease vector and the disease-causing agent itself and look at their characteristics in the laboratory. You can understand how frequently they bite, how long the vectors survive, what their incubation period is for disease, and so on. And you can generate a very precise function of the transmission potential as a function of temperature. If you then apply that to the temperature patterns you see in these locations, you get a measure of the change in transmission potential. And what you understand is that there is a peak when transmission potential is higher, and that occurs at warmer temperatures. The caution here, though, is what does this actually mean for disease? Does this mean that dengue or these other diseases will increase their transmission? And that's a very different question. Transmission potential is just that. It is potential. It is not real transmission. It is not to say that this is exactly what we are now facing. And as I frequently mention, is if you take Northern Europe, certainly in the UK, even in parts of Scandinavia, 150 years ago, we had malaria. I don't actually know whether you had it in Ireland. You probably did. But certainly in the UK, there was malaria. And some of the descriptions in Dickens' novels about fevers and so on almost certainly were descriptions of malaria cases. We have lost it, not because the temperature has cooled. It's quite the reverse. If anything, the climatic conditions become more favourable for the transmission of malaria than we had. But we've lost it because of all of the other environmental factors that have changed over that time. We've drained swampy lands. We've now got more advanced agriculture. Far fewer people are engaged in agriculture or working on the land. We live in housing with close-fitting doors and windows. We've got good healthcare, public health systems, and so on. So all those other factors have militated against the continuation of malaria, and for many, many years now, malaria has vanished from parts of Northern Europe, and indeed from these days from nearly all of Europe. But the balance is clearly shifting all the time. And bit by bit, as it gets warmer, the propensity or the potential for the other vector-borne diseases rises. It's very hard to understand exactly when the balance may shift critically. What we see already are bits of evidence suggesting that around the edge of the current distribution, there are occasions when spread occurs to different latitudes, to different altitudes against the current distribution of disease. It may be many years before there is a serious threat in the far north of Europe, but we, at the moment, don't know. There was an analysis published in Nature about 10 years ago now, I think, that took a century-long perspective and concluded that although climatic changes, it increases certain elements of propensity for malaria transmission to increase, in other respects, all those other social and environmental changes that have gone on over that period have reduced the risk of malaria transmission, and by about an order of magnitude greater, the influence of that latter factor is about an order of magnitude greater than the positive influence of global warming. The consequence is we've got now much less malaria than we once had. But we can't be certain of what the future will bring, and we cannot be assured that there won't be a substantial shift in a whole variety of different vector-borne illnesses. And the potential is certainly there for many to increase their spread around the globe. So this is slightly unfortunate in that one sense. It's only telling us about potential rather than reality. What we'd like to show is evidence, real evidence, of whether we are seeing changes, and if so, what those are in actual observed cases and in patterns with the disease vectors themselves. Another form of impact, again, which is being dealt with only largely through models, so it's partly using observed data, but then trying to look at relationships through statistical models, is the impact of temperature changes on crop production. And the simple message, but I think it is oversimple, is that for some crops, temperature rises can lead to reduction in capacity, in yields. And so the evidence that's cited here is that for every 1 degree Celsius in global temperatures, there's about a 10% fall in rice production. I think various aspects of that could be challenged, and if you look across the whole suite of different staples, it's a much more complicated message. But there is a very clear potential that for some current staple crops that changes in our weather conditions could have an adverse impact. I have been involved with other my colleagues at London School looking at some of the subsistence farming populations in sub-Saharan Africa. And there is a very clear evidence that even under the normal variations that you get, years of lower crop yields are years in which you see clear and persistent effects on the health of children under the age of 5, and in particular, an increase in child mortality in both the same year as the year of the crop deficit, but in every year for the following 5 years after that, so up to the age of 5 in the child population. So even quite modest shifts in subsistence farming population crop yields can have persistent and lasting effects on the health of children, and presumably also in other ages as well. So it's somewhat theoretical, it's somewhat indirect, but evidence about the connection between weather conditions, climatic conditions, and crop yields. What can we say on adaptation? This I find a very difficult area because what we really mean by adequate adaptation, even for the most direct question about the direct effect of heat or whatever, it's quite complicated to know how to answer the question, have we adapted successfully or not? The best way is if you can demonstrate that there was a relationship between temperature and mortality, say, which has become diminished over time, presumably as we get more successful in tackling that threat. This is somewhat different. It is not really a direct measure of how well we've achieved that adaptation process. It is only a measure of what efforts we are making. And this is simply you can't probably read them either. This one, this is overall spending, and this is a measure of spending as a proportion of national income. Low-income countries on the left-hand side, high income on the right-hand side, and through the intermediate categories in the middle. This is showing how much we are dedicating to adaptation for health. And unsurprisingly, there is a big gradient with income, country income. The higher income countries spend much more, but actually as a proportion of national income, it's relatively flat, and in some measures, it's higher in those populations in low and lower middle income countries. That's partly because they have greater need, also partly because they can gain access to investment funds to help in that process. But the problem overall is that actually very little of the total spending on adaptation goes to health. 4.6 directly on health, and another 13% maybe on health-related adaptation measures. We're clearly taking some steps. Whether we're doing enough, that's a very different question, a much more complicated question, which I think we cannot answer yet. I'm hoping if we are successful in establishing the Lancet process, we will be able to answer eventually. This is a survey of climate-resilient infrastructure, health infrastructure. I find it even more difficult to understand what this really means. Essentially, people were asked, what are you doing? Are you taking measures to ensure that your health systems, your health infrastructure is resilient to effects of climate change? Answer, yes or no. And essentially, countries responded, and those in the dark blue have reporting that they are taking measures, clearly taking measures to respond, and then there are a gradation of less enthusiastic or less committed responses elsewhere. But I think it's a very difficult thing to measure because it's so subjective in interpretation of what we think the risks are and how well you're responsive to them. And even if you think you are you are resilient to certain forms of health threat, when the challenge comes, it may be a very different matter that you are in practice. Nonetheless, a number of places are trying to make adaptation measures, and so there are some messages that we are at least taking note that there are risks to be dealt with. But I now turn to what I think is probably the most important. And I think it's the most important because it firstly goes at the heart of our response overall, of needing to implement change, profound change, across all sectors of the economy to deal with the fact that firstly we are overdrawing our bank account. just as we did for the financial crisis. We were living on debt and borrowing and promises of the future, and that came crashing down in 2007, 2008. We are the exact analogy overdrawing our account in environmental terms. We are happily at the moment reaping the benefits of apparent improvements in health and quality of life because we are overdrawing our environmental account. But there are limits on that, just as there are limits on debt, financial debt. And we have to, in order to address this problem, we have to take very big steps, profound steps across the economy. But the good news is that the things which we will need to implement are probably things which we are going to come to eventually anyway, and they are cleaner, healthier, better, more, a better quality of life would ensue if we can make those changes. So let me go into a little bit more detail. First of all, just to say that the report itself dealt with 5 different aspects of ancillary effects of climate change. They dealt with energy systems, transport, housing, health systems, and food and agriculture. The principles that I hope that we will eventually be able to implement and we set out for ourselves this year, but I think have failed really to be able to achieve so far, are the following. Firstly, that we want to be able to reflect stages in the pathways from current pressures and drivers of exposure, our use of energy, the emissions that we get from our energy sources, from our transport systems and so on, through to their effects on health, so that we can make a direct quantification of how much we are using energy of fossil fuels and how many people are dying as a consequence of that. It is easiest to understand in relation to air pollution, but there are links to other things too. Our overdependence on fossil fuels is important for physical activity. It's important because of our dietary patterns. We have a hugely energy-dense, high saturated fat diet, which is undoubtedly bad for us and would be helpful if we could change it. And surprisingly, or unsurprisingly perhaps, dietary patterns and agricultural yields which have a lower climate change impact are also ones that are better for health. So we want to measure what those connections are and quantify them. Quantify the current health burdens and the reductions in illness that are and could be realized from action aimed at climate change mitigation. And lastly, to reflect on the emissions of CO2, but also short-lived climate pollutants, including black carbon, a diesel pollutant, because they not only have health effects, but also give a way of making a more direct and short-term impact on climate itself. What we are aspiring to do and trying to achieve, but are only inching towards, is to be able to establish this chain of causality. This is something that I think the European Environment Agency developed. The Dipsy framework stands for drivers, pressures, states, impacts, and responses. And effectively takes the question and says, what's driving, what's the basic driver of our demand, of our use? What does that do in terms of changing the state of our environment? What is the impact on health? How are we responding? So here are the 5 titles for the Dipsy framework. There are variants which are sometimes used by WHO for environmental challenges. And I've kind of sort of populated it for one of the things which we think is the key target, or one of the very first targets we should be trying to achieve, which is coal-fired power generation. Coal-fired power generation is singularly bad, both from the climate change perspective and health. Per terawatt hour of production, burning coal is more polluting, both of CO2 and of toxic air pollutants, PM2.5, than any other major energy source. And it ought, therefore, to be phased out as a priority. And this is showing the sort of things that will help us to track the degree to which we succeed in doing that. So our drivers are the energy demand that we have. The pressures and through to the states are the emissions that come from coal-fired plants through to the concentration of the particulate pollution attributable to coal burning. And then the impacts on health are what we quantify as the loss of life, life years, premature deaths as a result, and finally, the responses we take to it. Everything to the left of that dotted line I still think of in terms of drivers or exposure patterns. Things we really want to be able to provide is evidence on the right-hand side, the health impacts, where we can quantify, well, how much, how many people are dying, or how many years of life lost are we losing because we have failed to reduce air pollution. Now, we are making some success on this, but it's a long story. What we hope to be able to do for all settings is to do this sort of trajectory, which is that we start from whatever baseline, I've taken 2015 here, and we have some measure of our health impact quantified on the y-axis, but then a trajectory agreed of what it is that we really need to do to achieve our climate change targets and other targets, whatever they happen to be that coincide between environment and public health. And then we can see, well, how much are we on course to achieve those? So I've drawn the lower line here would be what we think we have to do to meet the challenge. But then in reality, probably we only partly meet that, so I've drawn it as a dotted dashed line, sorry. And so at any point, there is a health benefit which we've managed to realize by cleaning up the world, but a bit that we have failed to realize because we aren't on track as we should be. So what is the evidence? Well, actually, I'm quite pleased that in the UK we are succeeding reasonably well in eliminating coal-fired power generation. We have a target to have it eliminated by 2030. And it was a bit of a landmark day that earlier this year, I think in April of this year, was the first day that no electricity was generated by the burning of burning of coal. We then had some other days when it came back in again, but there was a day in spring, the very first day ever, that no coal-fired power plant was required to provide the electricity needed for the population. And we should be on track to eliminate ahead of schedule of the 2030 deadline for the UK. And that's one of the positive signs and reflects a commitment saying that we need to take bold action, quick action to eliminate the most polluting sources first. What is it globally? Well, first of all, this is the proportion of our electricity we produce by renewable means, which, as you can see, is going up quite well over time. It looks an impressive curve, but it's from a very, very low base. So these are all big, seeming big increases, but they are from a pitifully low start. And they show, for example, I mean, the green curve looks very nice, but it's a very small population. It's Denmark. And Denmark, as you may know, have put a lot of effort into trying to generate clean electricity, and they have very large wind farms and other sources. Spain's got a lot. They're capitalizing on their solar power. I mean, it's a very sunny country, and so they ought to be able to capitalize a lot on that. And Germany looks very good. The UK is blue, and we're here, but Germany appears to be quite far ahead of us. But it is a complicated story to disentangle, because Germany looks very good on that measure, but actually it isn't so good. One of the reasons it isn't so good is because a few years ago, following the Fukushima nuclear accident in Japan, it took a decision, I think enshrined in law, to say that it would no longer have nuclear power generation. Now, you may have strong views on nuclear power generation, but I can make a very good case for you that the form of power generation that is best for health by a very, very long way is nuclear. Far, far, far people have died as a result of nuclear power generation than any of fossil fuel-based technology. It's just that you're singularly frightened of nuclear power in a way that you aren't of coal. But if you realize that hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people die year in, year out from coal generation, whereas even with Chernobyl and Fukushima, you can measure the number of deaths probably in a few hundred. In fact, it's doubtful if anybody at all died from the Fukushima accident. And yet, it's the one technology which has been outlawed. It's been outlawed by Germany. And that has caused a problem, because although they've got this good track of saying we've got lots of renewable generation, the bit that they don't show is how they're now replacing their nuclear technology, which is by essentially relying more heavily on the import of production based on coal. And quite a lot of that's based on brown coal, lignite, which is the worst form of coal, even worse than anthracite, which is the kind of conventional metamorphic form of coal. Lignite is worse. It's closer to peat. Very polluting, both from CO2 perspective and from health. And there are large lignite deposits in Poland, and Poland is resisting very vigorously reduction in the demand for the use of its lignite deposits. So it's a complicated story. And in fact, an interesting thing is I was in Jakarta leading up to the Paris talks, having some discussion about the health effects of various forms of power generation. And Indonesia, I think, is the world's biggest exporter of coal, and it's brown coal. And the part of the problem is that it has the capability to have very clean energy sources. It sits as part of the Pacific Ring of Fire. Its geology is such that it can have a lot of access to geothermal and other forms of power generation, but it has a lot of surface brown coal. And that is a big revenue generator for it. It is a source of wealth, and therefore a natural resource that it likes to use. Trying to change that balance is very complicated, therefore. Realities of the life, even if you wish to say we must get rid of coal and especially lignite, geopolitical realities of life and economic realities of life are such that that is much more complicated to implement in practice. But we have overall made some change. This is total primary energy from coal. It peaked in 2013, and it's been declining since then. So you can see the turnover. The grey curve here, which you read off against the right axis, is the global coal in total primary energy in exajoules. And these curves here are individual countries. The most influential at the moment is China, which is, if you can see, it's actually dark green. And notice that it's turned over in the last few years. Now, that actually represents probably a real change. But it is depressing. I had to give a talk at a conference last year, and I downloaded just before the day of the conference all the available data that I had at the time about emissions and CO2 concentrations and so on, and I just looked at the trends to that point. And the sad thing is, if you look at the trend over the last 30 or 40 years, for all of the measures, there is no evidence that they are still not relentlessly upward, i.e. getting worse all the time. True, if you look at the overall picture of our emissions, you see certain dips. And there's a lot being read into the dips of the last couple of years and saying, oh, look, things have flattened off. But actually, if you look back the last 30 or 40 years, there are several periods when that has happened. And without being too simplistic about it, you could almost have picked all of those dips entirely based on global recessions. So the first one was during what was sometimes called the Arab oil crisis in the early 1970s. Then there was one in the early 1980s, early 1990s. And I think this one now is more because the big producers of the world, which includes China, are kind of cooling off a bit. It's not that they haven't gone into recession, I don't think. But in the last few years, their kind of dramatic growth of recent years is cooling off. And I think it's those factors which mean that some of these patterns are flattening. More, and I don't deny that there are some benefits from these other useful trends of moving away from coal and so on, but I think that explains a lot of the apparent flattening off and dips that we see over the time. It takes a much longer view to know whether we are really achieving the reductions that we hope to see. Nonetheless, at face value, we begin to see here that there is some turning over the last few years, peaking in 2013, and this one shows the investment. Investment has risen in coal capacity a lot, actually, from 2006 to 2016, but it turned in 2016, the last year. And this very last bit here, we now see some sort of dip. Now, obviously, it would be nice to see how much further that goes, and we await to have further evidence year by year. That would be very good. But note however, that this is investment in coal dipping. It is not removing, it is not reversing, it is the rate of investment is slowing down. And the problem is that it means that there is still investment, and big investment, in particular in places like India, which are a very populous country, going through large-scale economic development, where they are continuing to invest in coal technology, and indeed, as we all do, in all sorts of fossil fuel technology. And the problem, of course, as you understand, is that once you invest in it, that technology then stays embedded and there for decades to come. A coal plant built today probably will continue to produce for at least 30 or 40 years. And that problem means that we are still embedding in our economic infrastructure all of the ingredients for continuing to make the climate change problem worse. And we haven't yet begun to grapple with the urgency needed to reduce and reduce quickly. Now, what are the consequences for health? Well, as I mentioned, what I hope we will be able to do eventually is to show you how the attributable burdens on health are declining as we clean up the environment by burning less fossil fuel. I can't do that yet. We may be able to begin to show the first parts of a series next year. But this year, all we have is for some selected countries, we put in the sources of air pollution and the quantified health impacts attributed to them. So here we've got a number of countries for Southeast Asia. It includes China and India. Close to 2 million people die prematurely in that region because of air pollution at the moment. And here are all the different sources. Actually, the blue from coal power generation isn't big in most of the settings. It's a sizable chunk in China and India. Notice that these are rates. These are per million inhabitants. And of course, because these have got enormous populations, that means enormous exposures. But there are all these different sources, and all of them should be targets for action. So they don't only include coal. That is one of the very first and easiest, most salient things to attack. But transport, household fuels, waste, shipping, and so on, all of these should be targets for action. And the hope is, of course, that as we manage to reduce each of these, you can begin to cross off or reduce each of these component bars. Those are real, near-term, realized health benefits that would accrue now. They aren't theoretical. We know with very good evidence and very precisely the relationship between outdoor air pollution and mortality and morbidity. And you can say that if you reduce the emissions and concentrations by a certain margin, there will be very clear, direct, quantifiable health benefits. And that's, therefore, the sort of evidence which I think we ought to be tracking, because we should need to make the case of all of these good things that come from this switch to the cleaner technology, but also to identify where we are failing to take actions and failing to realize some of those benefits that we could be achieving. So the report message for this section, anyway, was fairly, say, balanced. The delayed response to climate change over the past 15 years, my wording then, is a missed opportunity for human lives and livelihoods, meaning that if we had only had the energy, the wisdom, the determination to take changes earlier, we would already have far fewer problems than we now have. London is grappling with the fact that it's motivated now to take action on air pollution because it's in breach of European regulation and because there have been more and more evidence about the magnitude of the health impacts. If we had been taking rigorous action a decade ago, we would almost certainly have a much smaller problem than we now still have in London, and as most European and other countries around the world, other cities around the world. London actually is a relatively clean city in global terms. But a second conclusion is, although progress has been historically slow, the past 5 years have seen an accelerated response. And I think that is true. Generally, we are beginning to see the first direction shifts, more enlightened responses. And in 2017, momentum is building across a number of sectors. I hope that the direction of travel is set and that people will seize the opportunities that now exist, but it's not yet clear. The sad thing is that despite all of that, we are way off the pace in terms of the magnitude and speed with which we undertake any of the adjustments needed. But what can we do? Well, I show this because this is a sort of case study that we have for the UK. The National Health Service in the UK, because it is a single national organisation, is in a unique position and we have unique data for it. And we are one of the few health systems organisations in the world that has a sustainable development unit, specifically trying to target its own emissions in the healthcare sector. And to cut a long story short, the positive message is that the National Health System, the NHS, has reduced emissions by about 11% from 2007 to 2015, despite an increase in activity over that period. And that's because of very clear and dedicated cascading of information and of activities right across the board to limit the footprint of all the things that go on in the health system. And it needs to, because the health system is a remarkably big contributor to the footprint of the economy as a whole. Now, what I've done is gone through a sort of few patchy messages and bits of work that we are trying to assemble for this Lancet countdown. It is far from a comprehensive survey at the moment, and far less is it a thorough, objective analysis. So my reflection at the moment in this first report of where we are, and I must stress that this is a personal interpretation rather than the kind of the official line of what the Lancet countdown wishes to convey. My personal interpretation is that it is a useful synthesis, which we all hope will stimulate even stronger action on the formidable challenges of climate change, and importantly, the opportunities that we could realise if we take more vigorous, accelerated action. So far, however, my view is that it has insufficient focus on the attributable health impacts. We've had a lot of discussion about, what's happened to how much coal we're burning and how much energy we're using and so on. Very limited evidence in any of the markers, and there are 65 markers or something, that provide direct quantification of what is the impact on health. Even if the temperature changes, it's just a temperature exposure. It's not telling us how many people are dying of heat or of drought or of low crop yields. Those things, I think, will come. Secondly, we don't have the mechanism for what I think is the most crucial element here of tracking change. It's all still at the moment largely an advocacy exercise, saying, here is a survey of what's going on at the moment and some of the connections we think between climate change and health. But it is not tracking and holding ourselves, politicians, nations to account for how much action it is or is not taking. That is a crucial ingredient, and it must be objective. There is so much at the moment a temptation to provide evidence and interpret it subjectively, saying, well, we think there are some important connections here, or this clearly is a problem. We need good, standardized, objective evidence that we can compare year by year and show to everybody what progress we're making. So in my last slide, what do we conclude from the process so far? Firstly is that I think at the moment there is some evidence of more positive changes, but I use the word more deliberately because if you went back a few years, it was pretty uniquely or uniformly bleak. It's more positive now because there are some changes which are working in the right direction. There is undoubtedly some acceleration of our response to climate change. There is globally wider support for action and evidence that in a number of areas we are moving in the right direction at last. But, and it is a very big but in my view, in all areas analysed, and I think in all areas that we understand, the progress to date appears less than that needed to meet the scale of the challenge. And if I were being less objective about it, I would use words such as lamentable. It is pitiful how much we have achieved so far against the scale of the challenge. That's not to say that people haven't had goodwill and wanted to make change, but there is an enormous leap still to make to transform ourselves from where we are at the moment, which is still, over the last 2 decades at least, still continuing to accelerate the problem of climate change, not even to slow it down. The pace of change, as a moving average, has been accelerating towards worsening of climate change rather than even to start to turning it over. In consequence of that, we have failed to realize the full potential of the ancillary benefits that could come for human health. If we were to accelerate the transition to the low-carbon economy, there would be all sorts of things that would help us and we would consider be very important benefits. Quality of life, health, it would be a cleaner, brighter world, put in simplistic terms. And it's not a question of my mind that whether it will happen, but simply when. And the case that we're trying to make now is that the sooner we can grapple with it and try to bring that in, the better it will be for everyone. But there is also, sadly, the increasing probability that the climate change, which is now locked in and will continue to be added to, will proceed further and faster and with more adverse impact than suggested by our current international aspirations. So the Paris Agreement and trying to achieve the 1.5-degree world, laudable though it was, and a huge achievement in global terms to bring people together to agree at least an aspiration. But it is probably, always was, an unattainable aspiration. And the slower we continue to proceed, the more and more far from that achievable goal we become. It's therefore a difficult balance. On the one hand, I think we need to understand fully what the full magnitude of the challenge is before us, and not to kid ourselves that by taking small steps that we are doing sufficient action to achieve what needs to be achieved. It's not about having a little bit more recycling or a few people cycling every now and then. We need to engage a wholesale change across many sectors, perhaps all sectors of the economy, and to bring about big changes, largely technology-based, but ones that profoundly alter the way in which we run our lives and have dependence on fossil fuels. Were we to achieve that, I think we would all benefit, and it would be a more pleasant future world to live in, for all sorts of reasons, geopolitical as well as anything else. There are many geopolitical problems at the moment that essentially are based on the unequal distribution of those who have energy sources and those who do not. There is no reason in the future that we cannot help to reduce all of those inequities and ensure that we have a future planet which is sustained according to its own resources. The problem we are having to face at the moment, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, is exactly parallel to the one of our financial crisis of overdrawing our account. And we need to take action, but if we were to do so, then it would be a great benefit to us all. And we have the evidence, I think, from the Lancet countdown that we are beginning to make those steps, but still with nothing close to the pace of action that needs to be achieved eventually. And that, I hope, will be picked up over the next few years. I think that was my last slide. It is. So I'm happy to take any questions if you have any. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Paul. I should have welcomed at the beginning, there's people online in Dublin, Cork and Castlebar as well. So we'll take questions from the audience if there are any. I might need help with mics here as well. These are rolling out. Sure.
Yeah. Oh, there we go. You were talking about nuclear energy in the future for maybe clean energy production. I wanted to know what you thought about thorium rather than maybe enriched uranium in that aspect.
Well, I think India is quite likely to capitalize on thorium resources. I just want to make clear that I'm not really an advocate of nuclear power, except to say that it seems to me, an imbalance that it comes as the first target for things to cross off when we are struggling with a global climate challenge in which nuclear technology, at least as an interim measure, provides some way of tackling that challenge. In the long run, I hope we can get rid of nuclear altogether, and I'm sure we will. That may not be entirely, that leaves aside, though, the question of fusion, of course. Fusion power is still a possibility, and I hope, and probably will become eventually, an energy source for us. I'm not quite sure of the development of ITER in France, but there are a number of fusion experiments around the world at the moment which are progressing, and we are inching our way closer and closer to a fusion solution. The joke is we've always been 30 or 50 years away from having it as a commercial energy source, and it still remains that, even so we said that 50 years ago. But I think that will come, and so it's not that all nuclear technology is wrong. I think fusion is a possibility for us and maybe a major contributor in time. In the meantime, of course, we are reliant largely on fission technology, and I think different countries will use what resources they have. There is no reason, I mean, I'm not sure I have a particular view over thorium as against anything else, other than to say that I think places like India, which have thorium resources, will use it. They will use their coal. And it'll take some time to be persuaded not to do that. As with the example of the Indonesia and their coal resource, you know, what determines a lot of the choices is not simply an environmental question or a global climate change question. Of course, it's economics, it's what resources people have available to them, and it is the practicalities of sort of what is the most the easiest way for economies to grow, particularly low-income economies. I don't have a view particularly of thorium as against uranium as in terms of its risks. I would rather we didn't have either. But it certainly is a technology that I think will be capitalized on in future. The problem, I think, with a lot of that is more to do with geopolitical uncertainties because, of course, you know, India and Pakistan are both nuclear powers, and there's all the debate of Iran, and if Iran comes close to having nuclear power, then Saudi Arabia almost certainly, because of the distinction between the Sunni and Shia Muslims. It's an endless problem. So there is a separate question about nuclear weapons, I think. But in terms of power generation, I think it is a technology that I would not cross off first, put it that way, from all the things we can do. And of course, the risk or the concern is largely about accident and what that might do. And there's no doubt that if we had a nuclear accident maybe in mainland Europe somewhere, that would entirely change people's perception yet again. But it has been, so far, there are about 400 units, 420, I think, nuclear units in operation globally at the moment. It is actually overall remarkably safe technology of whatever technology there has been, and it's improving all the time. I think it is a useful intermediate solution to achieving climate change. And I would put all my efforts in getting rid of all the really polluting things first before we get rid of nuclear. And certainly I wouldn't want to stop any form of technology development, and that would include thorium, if that is a substitute for what otherwise would be a polluting fossil fuel.
Anything else?
Hi, Adrian. My name is Jamie Gorman. I'm, amongst other things, I'm the chairperson of Friends of the Earth in Ireland. I was struck by what you said about the unrealistic 1.5 target, and I think you're right. I think that's because of the lack of ambition from the industrialized nations to put their targets. But you know, when I was in Paris myself, I was lucky to be there at the negotiations, and one of the most powerful messages coming from the small island states was 1.5 to stay alive. You know, and recognizing that the rising sea levels, if we go beyond 1.5 degrees of warming, means that those states will simply cease to exist. So I just was wondering if you had any reflection.
Well,
challenge.
I concur with what you said and the sentiment behind it. I sort of have two views on this. I mean, in one sense, you think there is a lack of reality. How anybody could think that really it's achievable that we could come to 1.5. But as I mentioned in the earlier talk that I gave, that I'm actually involved in a project with a C40 group of cities. So this is a group that they are trying to demonstrate global leadership on the idea of achieving climate change mitigation and trying to achieve the target reductions that need to be achieved. And I am struck at how, on the surface at least, how ambitious they are. They are really setting out saying, this is what we have to do, and here is the target. And some of those are terrifyingly tough targets. Effectively, it means we have to be down to a tiny fraction of where we are within less than a decade. That's the sort of scale of the average reduction for, certainly for more polluting economies. But two things about that. The first is that when you then talk about them, and part of this work I'm now involved in, they're trying to look at, cities are trying to work out, well, what can they do? And when it comes to the actual policy choices and the steps that they have to take, it is much slower going and heavier and smaller incremental benefits than any of that ambition would suggest. They kind of say, yeah, we're going to slash our targets. And then you say, okay, well, what are you going to do? And part of this, they're putting forward a whole number of test case cities, putting forward some of their proposed steps. And they're all small scale. They're doing a bit of this and a bit of that, and they're putting in more cycles, and they're banning cars and this. But it's no big leaps. There was a book, I don't know whether many of you have read it, I forgot what it's called now. It's something like Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air or something. It was written by a Cambridge physicist, David McKay, in the UK, who became, or is, I think, still one of the government advisors. And what was interesting about his book, it was, as you might imagine, from a Cambridge physicist, it was very articulate, and he just did calculations saying, well, what is it you have to achieve? And showing, what sort of things you can get if you put out more photovoltaic cells, or if you cut emissions from this, or if you clean that. But in there somewhere, there's a statement to the effect that people think by doing lots of little things you achieve a lot. And he said, no, you don't. You've got to do a lot of very big things. Don't imagine that small-scale incremental steps will do it. They will not. And it's fascinating also in this piece that we're doing with the C40s, because one of the things that we are asked to do is sort of kind of come up with an estimate of what the population level impact is. Not what that change achieves for those who actually engage in it, but what does it represent against the targets for the whole population, both in CO2 terms, but also in terms of, because we're also looking at health benefits, things like air pollution. And almost universally, people's jaws drop when they begin to see, well, okay, well, we're going to put in this really impressive new scheme for diverting traffic or taking it off, and you look at the total contribution, and it's microscopic. We did a bit of analysis for London about 5 or 6 years ago of some ambitious plans of what could you do, and the three elements were that all of the public bus fleet would be driven by hydrogen fuel cell or electric or something based on renewable sources, that emissions be cut from all buildings by 40% by energy efficiency, and that half of all journeys less than 10 kilometres would be done by walking and cycling or by entirely renewably generated energy source public transport. The total of all of that was a 22% reduction in CO2 emissions. We have to achieve 80 or 90. So all of that combined is a quarter of the way there, perhaps. And that did not include travel between cities and all the other things which also we had to, and didn't include the embedded energy and the goods and services which we use, from agriculture and the rest of it. It is a formidable challenge, but all of it is doable. None of this is rocket science. None of the solutions are beyond us. It is simply the desire, and it has to be at population level, i.e. people want to do it as well as politicians, to take steps of bold enough type to be able to implement it. And what I always find disappointing is partly that we never have a discussion about the true magnitude of the steps which are needed, but also about, well, actually, what could that mean and what might the future be? And if we had that right level of debate more often and in a more intelligent way, I believe it would accelerate the enthusiasm among the population at large, and hence embolden politicians to make steps to try to implement some of those very big steps as required. At the moment, it's still far too much cautious incrementalism, which helps to make us feel a little bit better, but is still far short of the mark, and I think will be so sadly, for the 1.5 degree target set out in Paris.
I do Yvonne Finn School of Medicine, and I'm also involved in some community work in a very rural area in West of Ireland, so we're just looking at renewable energy and energy efficiency, and there's a lot of, I suppose, European and national and regional bodies involved. It's quite a complex area, and certainly need a lot of expert input into it. But my question is just in terms of Denmark. So it is a small country, but they have been very successful.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm sure there must be lessons to be learned there for all of us, and in their approach and how they achieved it. Was it a top-down or a bottom-up approach? Was it legislation? You know, what can we learn from it? And have they looked at health impact from achieving this great low CO2?
Yeah, actually, it's a good question. I don't quite know whether they've done a health impact calculation. There have been some Europe-wide ones that have looked at the impacts from different sources. So there was one produced by the Health and Environment Alliance year before last on the impacts from coal power generation, and doing a country-by-country analysis of how many people were killed and so on. Denmark, of course, is, I mean, like most of the Scandinavian countries, they're much more, they're a very different outlook. They have much more social outlook, I think, than we're used to in the UK, at least. And I'm sure that goes a long way to implementing the sorts of plans and policies that they have. I think it is very good, and there are very good lessons to learn from that. And it's we need to follow whatever it is that they've managed to achieve. I think that there are some very difficult, broader questions, though. And one of the problems is, even on things like energy efficiency, I'm actually not very sure energy efficiency works. And part of the problem with energy efficiency is most of you think of, there are many examples where if you improve the efficiency of things, all that happens is it makes it cheaper, and so people use it much more. So the examples are a car engine, which today is 100 times more efficient than it was when it first designed. And the consequence is we've gone from a few people owning them now to billions. The same for jet engines, the same for electric lights. Once upon a time, a modern-day light, a LED light is, 20, 30 times more efficient than the original light bulbs. But the consequence is we now light up our cities day and night. You can take a photograph from the satellite of the dark side of the Earth, and you can see all the cities at night. We use them many more. I mean, when I was a hard luck story, when I was a small boy, I used to have one central light in the room to light the rooms in my house. Now we have kind of lights everywhere, architectural lighting and mood lighting and this, that, and the other. So there may be more efficient light bulbs, but we have 20 of them now when we used to have one. And that's the way of the world, is that we tend to do more and more things. And that's part of the problem with energy efficiency, because if we make things cheaper, the bit that we then forget is, well, what do we do with the money left over? And one of the sobering problems is, whatever we choose to spend our money on, unless we kind of vaporize it or something or other, we spend it on something. And that something has a footprint. Even if you buy a book, a cup of coffee, whatever it happens to be, they all have footprints, and sometimes very big footprints. And part of the problem is that we are too rich. We have too much disposable resource. That is, we can command resource beyond our level. And if we save it in one area, we just redeploy it on buying something else, and that something else also has a footprint. To me, the key is we've got to change our energy source, and that's almost the beginning and end of it. If you have a clean enough energy source, it doesn't matter how much you use, almost, because if it's clean enough, it doesn't matter. Redistributing the way the economies work, the way efficiency works, is a more problematic thing. Getting a clean energy could solve the problem, but that's the rub. That's what we haven't got, and it implies, even if we have the right source, because I think part of the general view is that we'll need to have much more electricity-based energy carriers in future, even for heating homes and so on. But that also means big infrastructure change, which we are slow to implement. Imagine the task of having to change the heating of homes away from gas or other oil and other fossil fuels to electricity. You have to put a lot more infrastructure in to do that, and that's a 20, 30, 40-year enterprise to do it.
Thank you very much. That's a big challenge to everybody. We should probably wrap up, because is there any last pressing question? Listen, thank you very much, Paul. I should have said at the beginning, I mean, this is joint, this is hosted between the School of Medicine and the Ryan Institute and the Centre for Health and Environment in the Ryan Institute, which is the NUI Institute for Energy, Environment and Marine Research. So clearly you put huge challenges to us. There's huge research agendas, there's huge educational agendas in this that we all need to buy into, but there's also just basic things about the way we live. And we'll look forward to seeing what the Lancet countdown tells us in the coming years as to how we're making progress or not.
Very
So
good.
thank you very much.
Thank you.
So,